I've actually made this huge mistake in my own garden. Hi, it's Steph. Welcome back to Hooked and Rooted. Whether you're a beginner or experienced, we've all made mistakes in the garden. I know I have. And today I'm breaking down for you 13 of the most common gardening mistakes and how to avoid them to ensure success in your garden. Jumping into the list with the first one, not knowing your plant hardiness zone. It is essential to know your plant hardiness zone so that you can select plants that will not only survive, but that they will thrive in your climate. Each zone is determined by the average lowest winter temperature in your area. I garden in a zone 6B, 7A, and in my garden, I have a plant that is only on the cusp of being hardy here. It is a loropetalum or a Chinese fringe flower. And the hardiness zone on the fringe flower is from a 7B to a 9, which is a warmer climate than where I live. So if I were to leave that shrub out in the garden without offering it some protection over the winter, there's a high likelihood that it would not survive our climate. So I do place a winter shrub cover on it to make sure that it makes it through the winter. To determine your plant hardiness zone, all you have to do is go to Google and type in, what is my USDA gardening zone? You'll put in your zip code and it will tell you what zone you're in. And this will be really helpful in selecting perennials, trees, and shrubs that will thrive in your garden. Not knowing if your plant is an annual or perennial. Knowing if you have an annual or perennial is going to be key in understanding how that plant grows in your garden. An annual is a plant that grows, blooms, sets seeds, and dies all in the same season and never returns again. Some examples of that are things like marigolds, zinnias, and cosmos. And a perennial is a plant that comes back year after year. It will die down in winter, and in the spring, it will emerge with some new shoots from its roots and bloom again. Some examples of this are things like coneflowers and hosta. And there's even a third category called biennials. These are plants that have a 2-year life cycle, and they will grow all of their roots and foliage in the first year, they will bloom in the second year, and then they are done. Their life cycle is complete. And some examples of that are things like foxgloves and hollyhocks. So knowing which type of plant you're dealing with will really help you understand how it's going to grow in your garden. And your plant tags are the perfect place to not only give you the plant hardiness zone for your plant, as well as whether it is a perennial or an annual, and some other information such as spacing and so forth. Not knowing your plant's light requirements. Light is one of the most important factors when it comes to your plant's health, yet it's something that many gardeners overlook. Not placing your plant in the proper light conditions often leads to weak plants, fewer blooms, and plant failure. Plants that require full sun need 6 or more hours a day of direct sunlight. Usually these are things like flowers that bloom or plants that set fruit, such as coneflowers or tomatoes. In my garden, I have a shrub called a gold mop cypress. This golden shrub needs full sun in order to keep its bright yellow color. If it were to get too much shade, it would be more green. And you can see an example of this by looking underneath the foliage where it's shaded and not getting enough sun. It's just not as yellow. Plants that need part sun, part shade, those are plants that can take 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight per day. And some examples of that are things like coral bells or heuchera and bleeding hearts. And plants that like shade can survive with as little as 3 to 4 hours per day. And some examples of this are things like hostas or astilbe. It's important to observe the light conditions in your garden throughout the day because a sunny spot in the morning might be a shady spot in the afternoon. Once you have this information, you can better make a decision about where to put a plant so that it can thrive in your garden. Not paying attention to the mature size of a plant, tree, or shrub. Specifically with trees and shrubs, this can be really important because you don't want to create a maintenance nightmare for you going forward. Whenever you look at a specific tree or shrub that you're interested in, pay attention to the tag and believe what it says in terms of size. You might think that you'll be able to prune it to size control, but it can very quickly turn into a maintenance nightmare. I've actually made this huge mistake in my own garden, and here's a clip where I explain. About 12 years ago, when I was a new gardener and I had a new from scratch landscape, I planted this tree here because it was called a baby blue eyes blue spruce. And I was under the assumption incorrectly that it was a dwarf, and it is not. It has gotten much too large for this corner and will eventually, unfortunately, have to be removed. So a cautionary tale of mine hopefully serves as a lesson to you to really pay attention to the growth size on those tags. Whatever they say, believe them, and even add a little bit more space, because over time, evergreens, if they are happy, will grow. Know your soil conditions, specifically when it comes to moisture. Do you have areas in your garden that when it rains, maybe you get some puddling and some poor drainage? Or do you have areas in your garden that have a really good or gradual grade and it allows the water to drain really well? So those spots tend to be a bit drier. These are things that you need to know when you're planning on planting things in your garden. For example, here in my garden, I have a driveway that slopes downward and all of the water ends up over by my patio. So this planting bed that I have by my patio retains a lot of water and I end up with quite a bit of puddling when it rains and the water takes a while to dissipate. So I have lost quite a few plants over the years, which has taught me that I have to plant water-loving plants in this area. I planted a large birch tree, which happens to love water. I also planted some hydrangeas and some sweet flag ogon, which also handles water beautifully. So knowing which plants to plant in the right place really helps when it comes to selecting a site to plant in. On the flip side of that, if you have an area that drains really well, maybe a slope that goes downward so the water just keeps draining when it rains and the soil stays pretty dry, you know that that would be an area for plants that can handle dry, well-draining soil, such as sedums and even Russian sage. So observe the water conditions in your garden when it rains so you can best plant things that can thrive. Fertilizing and pruning your plants at the wrong time. Applying fertilizer at the wrong time can stimulate growth when your plant might not be ready, which can lead to weakened plants and introduce pests. Pruning at the wrong stage of growth can harm your plants, reduce your blooms, and slow the growth of the plant. An example of a plant that is really important to prune and fertilize at the right time are hydrangeas, specifically the macrophylla or old-fashioned mophead type hydrangeas that you usually associate with those big blue blooms. That variety of hydrangea typically blooms on old wood, which means that if you were to prune it at the incorrect time, you could risk lopping off that year's blooms. For that reason, those hydrangeas are typically pruned at the end of their bloom cycle. So when they finish blooming in the summer, you would go through and you would prune them and fertilize them so that they are ready to go for the following season. If you were to wait until late winter or early spring to prune that type of hydrangea, you would risk lopping off all of that year's blooms. So it's really important to know what plant you're dealing with so that you can prune and fertilize it at the correct time. Mulching too thickly around the base of your plant, also known as the mulch volcano. We've all seen this driving around where it looks like you have a big pile of mulch with a tree coming out of it and it looks like a volcano. But this is actually really harmful to the health of your tree or plant because having that much mulch around the base is going to add too much moisture to the roots, which can cause rotting. It also can suffocate the roots and provide less oxygen, which will weaken your plant or tree over time. So it's really important to just apply a thin layer, about 2 to 3 inches of mulch, which will help with weed suppression and give the plant just enough moisture, but won't suffocate it. And anytime that you apply mulch, you want to make sure that you feather it outwards and you don't have it leaning on the base or trunk of your plant or tree. Planting plants too deeply. The next time that you go to plant something in your garden, I want you to remember this. Plant it high, it won't die. Plant it low, it won't grow. So when you make a planting hole and you're removing soil, over time, naturally with rain, etc., that soil in that plant will settle. So it will continue to drop. So what I usually do is I leave about 1/4 of the root ball above the soil line, and that will account for enough space for you to be able to grade your soil around the root ball, apply a layer of mulch, and to settle. And once it settles, it'll land at the perfect place for the plant. However, if you make a planting hole that is too deep and you plant your plant too low, when you put the soil back over, you might end up with some water puddling on top, and with settling, it might even create a concave area, and over time you can rot your plant. So whenever in doubt, the best thing to do is plant it high. Only planting in spring. Many gardeners focus on spring planting, but the fall is actually one of the best times to plant, especially for things like perennials, trees, and shrubs. Why plant in the fall? Cooler temperatures means less stress on the plant versus planting in the summer. The soil is still warm, which means that the plant can establish roots before it hits winter dormancy. There's naturally more moisture in the fall, which means that your plants can settle with less watering. There is also less pests and weeds in the fall, which means less competition and less bugs to battle. You just want to make sure that anything that you plant in the fall, you do so at least 4 to 6 weeks before the ground freezes to allow your plant to establish roots before it goes into dormancy. Thinking everything in stock is also in season. Garden centers, nurseries, and stores will often stock items based on availability and demand, but not necessarily because it's the best planting time for your climate. You often see this at the beginning of the spring. You will see things like tomatoes available, which are warm weather plants. And if you buy those tomatoes and bring them home and plant them, they will get stunted or die because it is too cold out yet for those plants. The same with things like pansies and broccoli, which are cool weather plants that you might still see for sale in the summer. You don't want to buy those at that point because those pansies will peter out with the heat of the summer and you won't get any broccoli. So it's important to know your frost dates and your planting zone so that you know whether or not the plants that are available will thrive in your garden at that particular time. Not planting trees and structural plants first. This is a mistake that I made in my own garden. When I moved in nearly 14 years ago now, we first worked on the lawn and then I worked on some flower beds, when I really should have been focusing on planting the things that take the longest to grow, such as large trees that are the anchors and bones of your garden. By planting your large evergreens, trees, and shrubs first, it'll give them enough space and time to grow to their full potential. And this way you can then work around those larger structural trees by creating planting beds and so forth, versus doing the opposite where you create planting beds and now you're looking for places to stick a tree. Only planting singles of plants instead of groups of plants. I have been guilty of this in my garden, planting singletons, or what is often referred to as having a collector's garden. I have done this especially when I was a newer gardener because I wanted to try out different plants. And there's nothing wrong with doing that because after a few years you can divide those plants and then you can end up with groups of plants. And it's actually a really budget-friendly and frugal way to grow your garden. Purchasing plants in groups or planting in drifts allows your garden to look more balanced, which is generally more pleasing to the eye. Taking on too much at once. This is something that I've also been guilty of in my own garden. I started my landscape about 12 years ago. We had been in our house for 2 years and I wanted it all done yesterday. And it's just not possible because of time constraints and budget constraints. So take your time, tackle one project at a time so that it's less overwhelming. And once you get that done, you can move on to the next thing. It's a lot easier to work in small chunks than it is to try to do an overhaul all in one season. And you know, like the saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day, neither were beautiful gardens. And there you have it, 13 common gardening mistakes and how to avoid them. I hope that these tips were helpful to you, and if you make a mistake, it's okay. We've all done it, and it's how we learn. If you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you could hit the like button, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, it is free to do so, and it just allows YouTube to let you know the next time I post content like this. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and I'll catch you in the next one.